James Cartwright sat on his front porch, the evening sun casting a golden glow over his quiet suburban neighborhood. A retired Marine, James prided himself on his well-kept home, the neatly trimmed lawn, and the peace that came with living in a close-knit community. For years, this street had been his sanctuary, a place where he could relax without worrying about the chaos of the world. But lately, things had started to change. At first, it was little things, a bit of litter in the gutters, unfamiliar cars parked along the curb, and groups of strangers lingering too long at the playground down the street. James noticed, but didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood went through phases, he told himself. But then the graffiti started appearing on fences and garage doors. His neighbor's car was broken into. Late-night parties filled the air with loud music and laughter that didn't fade until dawn. The peace he cherished was slipping away. One evening, as James tended to his front yard, he spotted a group of men lounging on the corner, smoking and talking loudly. Their voices carried across the street, their laughter sharp and mocking. James's jaw tightened as he watched one of them flick a cigarette butt into the gutter. He stepped closer to the edge of his lawn, his military-trained instincts kicking in. "Hey!" he called out, his voice firm but calm. "You can't just dump your trash here. This is a neighborhood, not a landfill." The men turned to look at him, their expressions unreadable at first. Then one of them, a tall man with a smirk plastered across his face, stepped forward. "Relax, old man," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We're just hanging out. No harm done." "Maybe not to you," James shot back. "But this isn't your property. Show some respect." The smirk widened. "Respect? Funny coming from you." James felt his temper flare, but he kept his composure. He knew better than to escalate. Yet, as he turned back toward his house, the men's laughter followed him like a taunt. James clenched his fists. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The laughter echoed in James's mind long after he had stepped inside his house. He stood by the window, the curtains pulled back just enough to let him watch the group on the corner. They lingered for another hour, smoking and laughing, before finally sauntering away into the night. James's jaw tightened as he watched them go, a knot of frustration coiling tighter in his chest. The next morning, James stepped outside to fetch his paper and immediately noticed the mess they had left behind. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and scraps of food were scattered across the curb and onto his lawn. His blood boiled as he cleaned up the debris, each discarded item feeling like a personal insult. Over the following days, things only got worse. The group began showing up more frequently, their numbers growing each time. They lounged on the sidewalk during the day and loitered in the neighborhood at night, their presence an unspoken challenge to anyone who dared question them. Neighbors whispered about break-ins and vandalism, but no one seemed willing to confront the issue. James, however, refused to stay silent. One evening, after hearing from his neighbor that their car window had been smashed, James decided he had had enough. He walked down to the corner where the group was gathered, his boots thudding against the pavement with purpose. The men looked up as he approached, their smirks already in place. "We need to talk," James said, stopping a few feet away. His voice was steady, but the edge of authority was unmistakable. "About what?" one of them said, leaning back against a streetlight with a lazy grin. "This neighborhood," James said firmly. "You don't belong here. You're trespassing, vandalizing, and making people feel unsafe. It's time for you to move on." The tall man from before stepped forward, his smirk twisting into something more sinister. "And who's gonna make us, you?" he sneered. The group chuckled, their laughter grating on James's nerves. "I don't want trouble," James said, his voice hardening. "But if you keep this up, I'll make sure the authorities deal with it." The tall man's expression darkened. "You think the cops care about us? They've got bigger problems than some old man crying about his lawn." James stood his ground, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. "This is your last warning." The group didn't take him seriously. They dispersed eventually, but James knew it wasn't the end. That night, he installed security cameras around his property, determined to document their actions. If the police needed evidence, he would provide it. Over the next week, James's cameras captured everything. The group trespassing on private property, damaging cars, and leaving behind piles of trash. He compiled the footage into a neat file and brought it to the local police station. The officer on duty listened politely, but James could see the doubt in his eyes. "We'll look into it," the officer said, sliding the file across the desk. but it's tough to act on this. If these guys are undocumented, tracking them down and pressing charges gets complicated. James left the station feeling frustrated, but not defeated. He had spent his life in service to his country, fighting for justice and order, and he wasn't about to let bureaucracy stop him now. A few nights later, the situation escalated. James woke to the sound of shattering glass and rushed outside to find his truck's windshield smashed. A brick lay on the hood, surrounded by shards of glass. He scanned the street, but saw no one. The group was nowhere in sight, but he knew exactly who was responsible. The next morning, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He reached out to a few old military friends who lived nearby, explaining the situation. Together, they devised a plan to confront the group the next time they appeared. James wasn't looking for violence, but he wanted to send a clear message that their behavior wouldn't be tolerated. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James and his friends waited in the shadows near the corner. Sure enough, the group returned, their laughter carrying through the quiet streets. James stepped forward first, his friends flanking him, their presence a silent show of strength. "You think you can keep doing this?" James called out, his voice cutting through the night. The men turned, their smirks faltering as they took in the sight of James and his companions. The tall man stepped forward again, but this time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You don't scare us," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. "You should be scared," James replied, his tone cold, "because we've had enough. The cops might not care, but I do. And I'm not going to let you keep terrorizing this neighborhood." The standoff lasted several tense moments before the group began to back away, muttering curses under their breath. James watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew this wouldn't be the last he'd see of them, but for now, they had been pushed back. The next day, James received a visit from one of his neighbors, an elderly woman who lived alone. She thanked him for standing up to the group, her voice trembling with relief. "We've all been too afraid to say anything," she admitted. "But you've given us hope." Her words bolstered James's resolve. He doubled down on his efforts, continuing to document the group's activities and encouraging his neighbors to report any incidents. Slowly, the neighborhood began to rally behind him, their collective voice growing louder. But the group wasn't done yet. Late one night, as James walked home from the store, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see several of the men approaching, their faces shadowed under the dim streetlights. His pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "You've been causing us a lot of trouble," the tall man said, stepping into the light. His expression was twisted with anger. "Time to teach you a lesson." The group lunged at James, fists flying. His military training kicked in as he defended himself, but the numbers were against him. Blows landed, pain searing through his ribs and face as the group overwhelmed him. When it was over, they left him crumpled on the ground, their laughter echoing as they disappeared into the darkness. Bruised and battered, James pulled himself up and stumbled home. The next morning, he filed another report with the police, but their response was the same as before. "We'll do what we can." James knew he couldn't rely on them. He was on his own in this fight, and he was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about his neighborhood anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The sun was setting as James sat on his porch, the bruises on his face fading, but the fire in his chest burning brighter than ever. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of tension, fear, and defiance. He had taken a stand against the group terrorizing his neighborhood, but their retaliatory attack had left him battered, and even more determined. It wasn't long after that night in the alley that things began to shift. The evidence James had tirelessly collected finally caught the attention of the right people. With mounting pressure from the neighborhood and James's insistence, local law enforcement coordinated with immigration authorities. One evening, the neighborhood watched as a series of unmarked vans rolled through the streets, targeting the group's known hangouts. The next morning, the streets were quiet again, eerily so. The group was gone, detained and processed for deportation. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of peace returning to his community. Neighbors began to venture outside more, thanking him for his bravery and determination. Kids played on the sidewalks without fear, and the tension that had gripped the neighborhood began to loosen. But James couldn't shake the weight of it all. He sat on his porch, staring at the empty corner where the group used to gather. While he was relieved that they were gone, a part of him felt uneasy. He had fought hard to protect his community, but he couldn't ignore the complexity of what had happened. These men had made choices that hurt others, but they were also victims of a system that had failed them long before they arrived here. James took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. He knew he had done what was necessary to protect his home and his neighbors. Still, the fight had left its mark, not just on his body, but on his understanding of justice and responsibility. As the streetlights flickered on, James resolved to remain vigilant, ready to stand up for his community again if needed. For now, though, he allowed himself to savor the peace he had fought so hard to reclaim.